Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, what will be different about the Timberwolves offense moving forward? We saw glimpses of it against the Grizzlies, but without Karl-Anthony Towns, how will Rudy Gobert get involved? How will the Wolves offense operate overall? We're going to break that down, plus some quarter season grades by some folks around the NBA blogosphere. And finally, a preview of Wolves Thunder, the next game on Saturday night. We're going to break it all down here on the show today. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. And not a game day. The rare Friday off for the Wolves. They next play tomorrow night against the Oklahoma City Thunder. We'll preview that game at the end of the show today. Plenty to get to before that, though. First of all, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. That also includes the new Locked On Sports Minnesota app, which you can find on either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Download Locked On Sports Minnesota app today to get Locked On Wolves, Locked On Vikings, Locked On Golden Gophers, Locked On Wild, Locked On Twins. They're all there on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Again, the Locked On Sports Minnesota app. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken. That's with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right. I want to start by talking about the Timberwolves offense. So on Wednesday against Memphis, the Timberwolves had a decent offensive performance. It was sloppy. They actually didn't shoot the ball very well. They generated some decently open shots throughout the first quarter and a couple clutch shots in the fourth by, D'Lo hit a big three, Ant hit a couple of shots, but it was mostly scoring in the paint. The perimeter shooting was poor. It was under 31%, but they generated some additional open shots. Rudy had a slow game. I think he had 9 points, 1 rebound, 4 or 5 shooting. But he had that big alley-oop dunk down the stretch. He had another big basket down the stretch and had a rim run in transition. But all the baskets he made were off of lobs. They were all per usual right at the rim, but he had a couple big ones down the stretch. And I think not necessarily the efficiency, which wasn't there, but the overall flow of the Wolves offense and what they were trying to do, that's what we'll see moving forward with no Karl-Anthony Towns. What do I mean by that? So I think we'll see more pick and roll with no Karl-Anthony Towns. The Wolves were trying to do, they were trying to get the ball to Towns as often as possible on the perimeter, in the high post, in the mid post, and allow Towns to operate, which makes a ton of sense. And that's where Rudy was trying to figure out where he needed to be. And then sometimes the offense would kind of evolve. And I'm not going to say devolve, because a D'Lo Rudy or Ant Rudy pick and roll shouldn't be your last resort. It just hadn't been working so far this season. The spacing hadn't quite been figured out. I've talked about this before. I don't think it's a Cat Rudy thing. It's the Wolves guards, the Wolves ball handlers, the guys initiating the offense, Rudy thing, the chemistry there. And then also the Cat Rudy, when they don't have the ball, what does their spacing look like? You'd occasionally see Ant driving into the paint. You'd have Cat cutting and Rudy's already down there in the dunker spot and the spacing's messed up. Without Cat, the Wolves are very likely to go to just more straight pick and roll, whether that's Anthony Edwards or D'Angelo Russell handling the ball, or even Kyle Anderson, with Rudy screening and rolling, which is what he does best. Utah did a ton of it over the last several seasons, and we're going to see a lot more of that. Utah very often just played pick and roll in the middle of the floor, spread the rest of the floor with shooters, and just kind of rolled the ball out there and saw what happened in that situation. Donovan Mitchell was absolutely dynamite. They also had so many good corner three-point shooters, right? Mike Conley, Bogdanovich was massive from the corners. Bojan Bogdanovich is one of the best corner three-point shooters in the league. And I bring this up because the Wolves actually have some pretty good corner three-point shooters, and they don't shoot that many threes from the corner as a team. And if you're running pick and roll in the middle of the floor, you've got a ball handle, you've got Rudy Gobert in the middle of the floor. The other three guys are spaced. You're going to have a player in each corner that are completely, you're spreading the floor entirely, right? To get maximum spacing, you're going to have a guy in either corner. And in the case of the Jazz, Bogdanovich, well, actually, let's start with the Wolves this year, with where the Wolves rank this season in terms of corner threes. League wide, the Timberwolves are 25th, sitting here right now through 22 games in terms of corner 3-point frequency, less than 20%. In fact, to be precise, 19.5% of the Timberwolves 3-point shot attempts are coming from the corners. 19.5%. There's only 5 teams that shoot less corner 3-pointers in terms of rate than the Wolves. The Wolves are 22nd in corner 3-point percentage, shooting 35.4%. For context, there are 10 teams shooting above 40% from the corners. The Wolves are just a hair over 35% from the corners. But the Wolves' best corner 3-point shooters are hurt. I mean, Karl-Anthony Towns hasn't been great this year from the corners. In fact, just 25%. But for his career, he's a 41.1% 3-point shooter from the corners. Of course, he's 40% overall. So it's not that much better from the corners, but he's very good. And if you take that against everybody else on the Wolves, he's going to be about your best corner 3-point shooter. So, and Towns, again, there was that set they ran a lot last season, and the actually 2 seasons ago, the Saunders Finch year, when they split the season as head coach. They ran a set maybe once a game, a sideline out of bounds play to get Cat a corner 3-point attempt, and he was dynamite from the corner just a couple of years ago. And now this year he's 25%. But again, for his career, over 41%, 41.1% from the corners. And that's a shot. If they're running, let's call it a D'Lo Rudy pick and roll in the middle of the floor, you got Cat in one corner, you got Ant on the wing, on the opposite wing, waiting to cut, or waiting to spot up shoot. I mean, either one of those things, waiting for a kick out. If he gets a kick out pass, pump fakes and drives. I mean, Ant making a quick decision on the perimeter with the basketball is every team's nightmare. And if the D'Angelo Russell, Rudy Gobert pick and roll can work in the middle of the floor, then Ant can play off that and do anything you want. So right now, the corner 3-point shooters aren't going to be ultra dynamic. Kyle Anderson's been good from the corner so far this season. He's obviously, basically everyone's better from the corner. It's a shorter shot, obviously, than they are anywhere else in terms of 3-point shooting. Anderson's been great from the corner so far this season. Bryn Forbes on very small volume is actually making 2/3 of his shots from the corners. Taurean Prince, who's out, of course. Prince is always a good corner 3-point shooter. So if the Wolves can figure this out now, and the corner 3-point shot is efficient, they can up the frequency of corner 3-point shot attempts, and then have D'Lo and Rudy operating in the middle of the floor. The offense is going to be that much better for when Karl-Anthony Towns does come back, when Taurean Prince does come back, which, of course, Prince should be back in hopefully the next week or so. And say you've got Rudy and D'Lo in the middle of the floor, you've got Ant on the wing, and you've got Towns and Prince in the corners, or Towns and Jaden McDaniels in the corners. Not as fearsome of a 3-point shooter, but this year he's shooting 41% from the corners. A little more than a third of his 3-point attempts have come from the corners. And if he could continue to be in that neighborhood, McDaniels from above the break has not been a good 3-point shooter. If he could continue to be a good 3-point shooter from the corners, that's pretty dynamic. If you have 2 guys who are going to shoot 41% from the corners in Towns and McDaniels, you have Ant on the wing, and you have D'Lo and Rudy running pick and roll. And of course you can swap D'Lo and Ant. And D'Lo is a very good catch and shoot 3-point shooter. There's so many options that can come out of that. It's very simple offense. It's not as complicated as a lot of things that, I would say Finch doesn't necessarily want to run a complicated offense. He likes to try and do a few different things, right? We've seen certain games where he's called a number of set plays in a row to get the Wolves into a rhythm. And I think sometimes that's really important, especially with a team that hasn't ever really found a rhythm on their own within those bumpers that Finch has tried to set up. But this particular offense, it doesn't have to be complicated. It's spreading the floor and running pick and roll. You're going to best use Rudy's capabilities and roll gravity, right? As one of the best screen setters and best divers to the rim in the entire league. Teams are going to be drawn to that. The defense will suck towards the paint, and you're going to have wide open shooters. And that was kind of the theory all along. But of course you want to run your offense through Towns. The temptation is too great, and rightfully so. But now with Towns out of the picture for the next several weeks, do the Wolves just simplify things, run, spread pick and roll, get some corner 3-point shots, ultimately get a more efficient offense running. And then when Towns comes back, don't overthink it, right? When Rudy's off the floor and Towns is in there as a 5, do anything you would have done last year. Run tons of high post actions, perimeter actions for Towns. I know that he's been driving to set up the 3. That's how Towns has played the last couple of seasons, is he drives to set up his 3-point shot. It's not the other way around. But you can do anything you want with Towns. He's a true 3-level scorer. He's ultimate, just insanely dynamic with the ball in his hands. So when Towns is on the floor as the 5 and Rudy's off the floor, do all that stuff. When Towns is on the floor as the 4 and Rudy's the 5, make Towns a souped up version, if you will, of Bogdanovich. Make Towns not simply a spot up shooter, but a spot up shooter that can also attack you off the dribble, or could back you into the post, or could score any number of ways if you don't honor his presence on the perimeter. Otherwise, you got to deal with Ant as a cutter. You got to deal with Rudy diving to the rim. There's lots of different ways that this thing could go. And if they can figure it out with Towns unavailable, think about how dynamic this offense could be when Towns does get back on the floor. Okay. I want to take a little bit of a step backwards and look at the team as a whole sitting here right now. Some midseason grades that I want to evaluate the evaluation of the Wolves. And then we'll get to a Wolves Thunder, a Wolves Thunder preview here in just a moment. First, though, today's show is presented to us by our friends at BetOnline, the title sponsors of today's show. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from football to basketball to soccer and esports. We've got it all at BetOnline.net. The Wolves will be favored against the Thunder on Saturday, no doubt. We don't know yet if Shai Gilgeous-Alexander will play. That obviously will impact the line. He did not play on Wednesday, but actually has only missed 2 games this year, one of which was against the Wolves. So check out the line for Wolves Thunder on Saturday at BetOnline. If you love sports podcasts, you can also find those at BetOnline. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thanks again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen today. Now, for your second listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today show. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. All right, let's talk about some midseason grades that were handed out by CBS Sports. And these were kind of a mishmash of their different writers. I don't actually know which one wrote the Timberwolves grade, but I want to kind of riff off of that. I'll read a quick excerpt from it. We're at the quarter pole of the season, slightly over for the Wolves. They played 22 games. Of course, they're 11-11. So actually, let's start with my thoughts on the Wolves to this point this season. I said that I did this about a week ago before. I guess it was like right around in the middle of the Wolves 5-game winning streak, when I talked a little bit about how, like, hey, they're only a game or two worse than what I would have even expected them to be, right? They won some games you wouldn't have thought. A couple games you wouldn't have thought. They lost some games you wouldn't have necessarily expected them to lose, but you look up and it's effectively the same record, right? I mean, they beat Oklahoma City twice. That's what we expected. It may not have been pretty, but it happened. They lost to Utah, which wasn't expected necessarily. They only won 1 out of 3 games against San Antonio, which wasn't expected. I don't think coming into the season, we would have thought the Wolves would necessarily beat the Suns and the Bucks. And they lost the Suns both times. They lost to the Bucks. They beat Houston, which we thought they'd do. They beat the Lakers. And then, winning at Cleveland, yes, they had some good fortune with guys being out. Winning at Philadelphia, same thing. Winning against Miami, same thing. Those are all wins that, looking at the schedule, through the first 10 games, I think I said, first 20 games, I thought the Wolves would probably be, 11-9, maybe 12-8. And what were they? They were 10-10. So, 1 to 2 games worse than I would have thought they'd be. No, they haven't had very many convincing wins. No, there hasn't been. And Marty and I talked about this on the postcast the other night. Or maybe it might have been off air. We were talking about this. Like, I mean, how many games can you feel good about so far this season for the Wolves? How many games have the Wolves won comfortably? Games that we felt coming into it like, hey, the Wolves should win this game, and they win it wire to wire. The Pacers game, and the Pacers are actually better than people expected them to be. That's easily the best all-around game for the Wolves this year. The Lakers game, the Wolves won by 9. It was relatively comfortable. Like that one's the other one that comes to mind. One of the Spurs games, they won by double figures, even though it was kind of dicey. The defense wasn't great. So like maybe those three, opening night against the Thunder was not easy, but it was a pretty well played game in terms of as far as openers go. So certainly less than 5, right? They're 11-11. There's less than 5 games you could say, yeah, the Wolves played well. The Grizzlies win obviously is a nice win without Karl-Anthony Towns, but it was sloppy. It wasn't comfortable, right? It probably is like the 5th best game the Wolves have played this year, honestly, if we're finding a top 5. So, and I bring that up to say that, well, I probably would have said sitting here right now through, we'll call it, 22 games, I thought the Wolves would probably be 13-9, maybe 12-10. They're 11-11. That's only 1 or 2 games worse than I think most of us would have thought, right? I challenge you to do this yourself. Go through the schedule. Try and put yourself in the headspace of where you're at before the season and go through and write W's and L's next to the whole thing and next to every game. And I bet you'll come up with like 13-9-ish, give or take a game. Maybe 14-8 if you were super confident about the start to the season. I thought the Wolves would start really well. I thought they'd probably start 5-0, honestly. And they started 3-2, which is still only 2 games off what I thought, right? So it's, even though the wins have not been comfortable and they haven't left us feeling good about the team, the number is not all that different from what we thought. And so, I think it's really important to acknowledge, like, it's obvious this team has under-delivered. They're not meeting the expectations that anybody had before the season. And of course, if you factor in the costs to get Rudy Gobert, that's a conversation for another day, but you have to factor that in, right? But still, currently, if the playoffs started right now, the Wolves would be in the play-in. Like they're 500 in a Western Conference that nobody really seems to want to pull away. I mean, they just beat Memphis, who's one of the better teams in the conference, and they've now split 2 games against them. And you get OKC and Indiana at home now. The Wolves could legit be 13-11 going on the road for a tough West Coast road trip. But things could be much worse in terms of where the Wolves are sitting now. With all that said, the CBS Sports article gives the Timberwolves a D in terms of quarter season grade through the first quarter of the season. Talks about the good vibes of opening night turning toxic related to Rudy Gobert's acquisition. This particular writer predicted the Wolves to be a surefire 50-win team before the season and is already regretting that. What did I think I said the Wolves over-under was 47.5, and I said, or 48.5, and I said to pound the over. I thought they'd win. What was my prediction? 52 wins, 53 wins, something like that. That at this point, that does seem difficult, and certainly wouldn't call them a surefire 50-win team, but 50 wins is not insane still, right? I mean, a 500 record's 41, right? So the Wolves just need to outpace themselves, over the last 3 quarters of the season as the team improves. I mean, think about where they were last year, and they ended up winning 46 games. The ceiling of this year's team is higher, even if the floor of last year's team was, evidently higher as well. This year's ceiling is absolutely higher. So it's not outside the question they could still get to 50 wins. Talks about how Kyle Anderson is worse defensively than Jared Vanderbilt, which is a complicated debate, I think, but one that I'll leave alone for now. Talks about how Jaden McDaniels has been good, but they miss Vanderbilt and Beverly. That's obvious. And that the Wolves bet that Gobert would negate all the losses of Beverly, losing Beverly and losing Vanderbilt has been incorrect. And then they say hovering around 500 is not a total fail in a Western Conference that is tightly packed and thus wide open for a team that has started slow to figure things out, but it sure doesn't feel like this is going to end well. It's hard to really quibble with too much of what they said, but I'll go back to remind you about what I said like 3 minutes ago. Like if they were 14-11, or that math is wrong, 14-9, 14-8, I guess it'd be 14-8 through 22 games. Would there be alarm bells ringing? Probably not. That's only 3 games difference. And there's a couple, actually the Wolves haven't played that many actual close games, but like, I don't know. I don't think that it's quite as drastic as those of us who live and die with every single game might think that it is, right? There's a lot still to like about where this team can go. It was just a few days ago before the Towns injury that I started talking about how much bad luck the Wolves have had in terms of 3-point shooting this year, right? They've got how many guys shooting below league average? And I made the same case 11 months ago. Go back and listen. It was like late December, early January. I had a couple shows where I talked extensively about like, hey, Taurean Prince is shooting 20% from 3. Patrick Beverley is shooting way below his career average. D'Angelo Russell is shooting way below his career average. That's all going to bounce back. I was definitely right about Taurean Prince because that dude was on fire the second half of last season from three. D'Lo improved and Beverly improved. They both still shot below career averages. But the point I was making is if this team keeps doing what they're doing, improves at a couple little things, but then just like eventually shoots the ball better because they're all going to, right? There will be a progression to the mean. We're still kind of in that territory, right? D'Lo's three-point shooting will improve. Ant's three-point shooting will improve. Jalen Noel's three-point shooting will improve. Bryn Forbes, if he sees the floor, will shoot the ball better. This team has guys with a track record of Towns is the most obvious example. Of course, he's out now for several weeks, but this team has professionals that have shot the ball, have a track record of success shooting the ball from the perimeter. And those things are also going to play into as the team gets more familiar with playing with one another. This isn't a 500 team. This team is still going to win 40, mid 40s, upper 40s games with an outside shot at still hitting 50 wins. That's all very much on the table. Yes, the West is deep, but so far it's not elite deep, right? It's just there's a lot of like I could tell you who your top three teams are in the West, your bottom three, and everybody else, there's just a ton of muck in the middle. Like what's going to shake out for the middle of the Western Conference? The Wolves have one of the highest ceilings of any of those teams. I still believe that. And going back to the first segment, there's a lot that the Wolves could do right now to clean up their offense, simplify their offense, let Rudy be comfortable, and then plug Towns right back in. And I do think it'll be more simple. The more I've thought about it, the more I shouldn't say simple. I think plugging Towns back in will be easier than it seems on face value. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've started to feel that way. So we'll have plenty more time to talk about that. I'm very curious to see how much the Wolves offense looks like it did Wednesday versus how much it did before Towns got hurt against the Thunder on Saturday. I want to close the show with the Thunder preview. OKC's played a lot better than people expected, so I want to preview that matchup here next. All right, the Oklahoma City Thunder are currently 9-13, which is, I think, better than most people thought they would be. If we're talking effectively a quarter of the way through the season, 22 games through the season. On Wednesday night, the Thunder beat the Spurs by 8 in a game that San Antonio led by 20. The Spurs were up by 17 at halftime, up by 20 at one point, and the Thunder ended up winning that game by 8. And recently, I should also say the Thunder, of course, this game's at Target Center. Each team has a couple days off. OKC is actually 6-5 at home at Paycom Center in Oklahoma City, but they're just 3-8 on the road. So before the Spurs win, they'd lost on the road to the Pelicans. They'd lost on the road to the lowly Houston Rockets. One of the few teams I think most people thought would actually be worse than the Thunder. The Thunder just lost to them by 13. And before that, they had beaten the Bulls at home. Go back a bit further, they lost on the road to the Grizzlies and Celtics and beat the Wizards and the Knicks on their previous road trip. So, I mean, like 9-13, that's, of course, only 2 games worse than the Wolves. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander didn't play Wednesday, and they still beat the Spurs. SGA has been phenomenal this season. I mean, like, nope. Assuming the Thunder don't play above 500 this season, they won't finish at 500. Nobody on a 500 team is going to win the MVP, but SJ's legit been one of the best players in the league this season. There's no doubt about that. You look at the sheer scoring numbers are incredible. He's averaging over 30 points a game, 31.1 points per game on 50.6% shooting, 50% from the floor. He's only shooting 3 threes per game, but he's at 34%, which is, that'll get the job done because he's so good inside the arc. And he's averaging more than 6 assists per game. Just a really, really good all-around player. And there's not much else around him in terms of like current developed NBA level talent. Now, I mean, there's some guys. Kendrick Williams is a really nice player. They've got some nice rotation type guys. I've always liked Lou Dort. But then they've got some guys that probably aren't long-term NBA players. And they've got guys that haven't developed, like Josh Giddey has had some ups this season, but more downs. He's not shooting the ball well. He's just not an efficient player at this point. The defense is spotty. They're playing some really young guys, Ousmane Deng. I really do also like Jalen Williams. So a fun roster. We don't know if SGA is going to play. Again, he didn't play Wednesday, but he's listed as day-to-day, so questionable for the Wolves game with the hip injury. And then also Minnesota native Mike Muscala will likely still be out on Saturday as well. So no Muscala, rotation player for them who played well in the games against the Wolves earlier this year. And 50-50, it looks like, on SGA playing. But again, either way, those guys didn't play Wednesday. Now the Spurs have lost, I think 9 in a row, or 6 in a row or something. So not the toughest opponent to come back on. But still, the Wolves have to take OKC seriously. We're only a week removed from that Charlotte debacle when everybody was feeling great about a 5-game winning streak. And hey, the Hornets, they're one of the worst teams in the league, the worst offense in the league. And what happened? The Wolves came out and had a lead at halftime, felt good about themselves, and imploded in the third quarter. So the Wolves need to be careful to not let that happen against the Thunder. And OKC, they've played competitively this season, there's not really all that much to write home about for them offensively. They shoot a lot of threes, but they're 23rd in percentage. They're 27th in free throw rate. They don't get to the line a ton. They don't really turn the ball over, which is important for them. And they're a pretty good offensive rebounding team. That's something that Josh Giddey's good at, among others. But Kendrick Williams, I guess, would be one of the main culprits, if you will, there. What the Wolves need to remember, though, is this is actually a team the Wolves could out-rebound on the defensive glass. The Thunder are actually 29th in defensive rebound rate in the league. The Wolves are actually up to I think they're 25th, if I'm not mistaken. I have it right here. The Wolves are up to 25th in defensive rebound rate, believe it or not, even after that Memphis debacle from a rebounding perspective, minus 30 on the glass in that game. But the Thunder is 29th. So the Wolves have a legit shot to out-rebound somebody, to keep somebody off the defensive glass and get their own offensive rebounds, of course, without Towns. But that's something that Gobert is very good at. And recently, some other guys have pitched in as well. Some of the guards and wings have finally started to rebound. So an opportunity for the Wolves to do some damage on the glass as well against a poor rebounding team, a team that doesn't have much size, right? I mean, Pokusevski is over 7 feet tall, but he's not a center. Remember that from earlier this season when the Wolves beat the Thunder twice. There's not much size to this Thunder team. So the Wolves should be able to dominate in the paint and on the glass. Rudy Gobert should be able to have a big game. Naz Reid should have another big game, like he had a great game off the bench the other night. Ant had a massive game last time these two teams played. 30 points at 19 shots way back in the third game of the season for Minnesota. That was the game in OKC. Ant had 30 points, 11 rebounds, was 13 of 19 shooting. Rudy had 15 and 15, so did dominate inside, and Jalen Noel had 14 and 6 off the bench. So this is a matchup that the Wolves should win. But again, we're a week removed from Charlotte, so anything could happen in this one. We will have a live postcast. Marnie's off on Saturday, so I'll do the live postcast solo on Saturday night. Be sure to tune in to that live postcast about 45 minutes after the game on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. And then also the audio will, of course, post on all the Locked On Wolves channels. A big thank you to those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, the show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, and Locked On Sports Minnesota, the new app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. And a reminder that for your second listen, you can check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.